Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 17. I actually did look it up this time before we started the show. Welcome
Yep.
to episode 17 of the Intersection 4 podcast. We have only two of your usual three here, and we're still looking for number four. But we're still going, still kicking.
Okay.
Hamiz, the investor, and me, the philosopher and founder and product person too. So the news are out, no longer at Google. In fact, if you can see behind me, we are at the new office for the company. So
Nice.
working out about WeWork. Amiz was asking me how the WeWork was and all that fun stuff. But yeah, so what we have today for you guys in the docket or in the agenda, we have, as usual, our usual topic, AI. But this time we're going to be talking about Apple Intelligence.
hmm
We're going to be talking about the recent announcement that Apple did at WWDC about their latest AI move and some of the things that are playing into their announcement, the companies they killed, and the discussion is going to mainly be revolving around that. So
hmm
yeah, so let's go ahead and get started with that, and then we're gonna probably end up navigating some other topics here. But
Yeah.
I
So let
miss.
me.
Let's talk. Yeah, you give us a primer here.
Yeah. Very interesting news. Obviously, a lot of people felt that Apple was a little bit behind from the big tech companies when it came to, kind of jumping on the bandwagon of AI. But then when they did jump on the bandwagon in typical Apple fashion, they went and partnered up, with the biggest company in the space, and are trying to, in my opinion, play catch up. But underneath the noise of this, new partnership, there's quite a few like interesting things to kind of discover, rediscover, and think through. So my first question for you, Sam, is like, what was it in the announcement that you expected, and what was it in the announcement that was surprising?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Let's good place to start. And actually, I was just as you were talking, I was looking through the Apple stock. One thing that I did notice is so the announcement happened around 3 days ago, I think. So we're recording this on a Thursday. The announcement happened, I think, on Monday, if I'm not mistaken. But it's interesting because the stock took a minute to react. I mean, the announcement happened, I think, on June 10th.
Mhm.
Um, there was like sideways trading for a little bit, kind of like the market was trying to make up what they were thinking about the announcement, and then things kind of like picked up afterwards. But yeah,
Mhm.
just something interesting to know that it took the market a little bit to react. Apple is up 10% in the week, so I just wanted to sort of share that little nugget of
Mhm.
interesting intel. But so okay, to your point, what was the most exciting thing or the most surprising and the least surprising thing. So the least surprising thing I would say was just the announcement itself and the idea of AI on your own personal data. And for those who may not be super familiar, I guess, with Apple Intelligence, so let's just kind of like give a quick overview. So Apple Intelligence was an announcement made by Apple um, in their latest really big announcement conference. They're basically just announcing AI. They're jumping in the AI bandwagon, but basically what they're doing differently is, of course, being Apple, they have this very slick design and they're packaging AI in a really interesting way. But the really really cool part is that it is built or it is created with the intent of using generative AI on your personal data or on your unique data and protecting privacy in that way. So you can have access to a lot of the features that are native to your phone. You can have access to your contacts, to your image library, and it's a much more integrated way to interact with large language models. So the really big thing and the reason why they're rebranding it as Apple Intelligence, right, as opposed to just calling it AI or some other stuff, is to showcase it as a unique thing, as something different than going to the chatbot and just interacting with it and having it give you some information, but actually a much more integrated and useful. They actually use the word useful quite a bit during the demo. A much more useful experience with AI. But now to your original question of what was the most surprising, what was the least surprising part of it? I think the least surprising part of it was to actually do this. it was obvious, right? It was an obvious play for Apple. I actually made a thread not too long ago analyzing
Hmm.
that, and that was my take too. Like, it was obvious for them to do this. There's so many companies, I mean, that popped up in the last few years, with the whole premise of AI on your personal data. So
Hmm.
listening to your conversations and having access to your data and all that. And it was obvious that the company that had to do this was Apple. So
Hmm.
that was the first thing. Like, this is obvious to me. So Humane, Rabbit, all of those were trying to build that integrated play of AI, thinking that Apple was never going to catch up. Obviously, they caught up, and it was the obvious play for them. That was very obvious. What was really surprising for me, though, was if you scroll down here. Um, so yeah, this image was really interesting. So the models that are actually powering Apple Intelligence were created and built by Apple directly. So there's two models here. So one is built on device. One is on your phone or your machine, whatever you're using to connect with Apple Intelligence. I think it's only the latest tier of devices that Apple Intelligence is going to come enabled. But then the model is running directly on your device and is comparative and actually much better than a lot of the smaller, similar size models. It's a 3 billion parameter model that Apple trained and has some specific fine tuning for multiple tasks that the model can carry out. And for more complex tasks that require a much bigger model, they have a model hosted on Apple's cloud in this new like privacy preserving cloud environment that they created, and that is also the run model. There is no information around how big the model is or how many parameters it has or what is the size of the model, but it performs really freaking well, actually. Performs better than GPT 3.5, which is the free version of ChatGPT. Performs better than Mistral and some other models of quite like state of the art. And it performs extremely close to GPT-4 Turbo, according, of course, to this benchmarking mechanism that they use. Right, it's probably the
Hmm.
best benchmarking tool or best benchmarking results that they got, but it's still pretty surprising. So that was really surprising to me, the fact that they built their own models. Um, Not only that they built their own models, but especially that the models were so performant. So I don't
Hmm.
know. I'm still thinking about what to make of it, but that was a
Mm,
really big surprising part. So
surprise.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I feel what was surprising to me was, well, actually, it was not surprising and surprising, is that they went and, partnered up with OpenAI. But what was surprising is why they would even do something. What was not surprising is if you're Apple, that's the company that you partner up with. But what was surprising is why they even did that. Because what it makes it seem like is there's some exclusive relationship between Apple and OpenAI. But when you dig underneath the surface, that's not the intention at all. So to me, it almost felt like a little bit of like a, you know, PR move more than like what actually is happening, as you were just demonstrating, right? So they have their own models and they plan to use other models outside of OpenAI. But when you first kind of hear the news or see how the media is portraying the news, it's as if OpenAI has already won the Apple iOS ecosystem, and there's nobody else in that's playing against them. And that's the impression that a lot of people have. But underneath the surface, they're saying, yeah, we'll have a non-exclusive like relationship with you, and our models will compete with you, and other models will compete with you in the same in the same brain. So I feel like it was more of a PR move and less of a and maybe even more of a move to move the stock, but it was less of like what was actually the long-term plan.
What was in it? What was in it for OpenAI, and what was in it for Apple from your perspective?
OpenAI just went from a $98 billion valuation to probably $150 billion valuation, right? Because now the investors that are not paying attention to these differences are projecting out, the 2 billion devices that Apple has multiplied by whatever else they might make from it. But so two things to really pay attention to, right? If you dig into it, there's no exclusivity. That's number one between either side. So Apple's not exclusive to OpenAI, and OpenAI is not exclusive to Apple, obviously. But the second thing to dig into is that they don't expect to make any money from this. Neither side does, right? And so Apple's kind of position is, well, we just made you the most legitimate. Well, we were already one of the most legitimate, but we made you even more legitimate of a company, and that's plenty value that we've given you. So we're not going to pay you. That's actually like the almost like the official position here is we're not paying you for this. Us bringing you on the platform is payment enough. And OpenAI is like, yeah, we'll run on 2 billion devices. God knows how much money they're going to spend running on those 2 billion devices. But there's not really
Wait,
like a
wait, I think
clear.
it's let me make a clarification here too. That is important. So, OpenAI or ChatGPT, GPT 3.4, 3.5, or GPT-4 is not running on the devices, and there is no like OpenAI doesn't magically have access to any of these devices. So the way that this is happening is when you actually go to use
Mhm.
Siri, now loaded with this AI capabilities, it is going to
Hmm.
ask you, it's going to prompt you every time, do you want to use ChatGPT to do that? Or I can use ChatGPT to do that. Do you want to do that? And then if you say share this data or share this prompt with ChatGPT, then Apple is probably going to actually go and hit ChatGPT servers. And at that
Sure,
point, probably the data that's getting transferred is subject to OpenAI's terms of service. But Apple itself is not really like the model is not running on the device,
sure.
and it's not by default. It's not a default position. So I
Sure,
just make
sure.
that
No,
caveat
no,
there.
that's good clarification. In any case, what's happening is OpenAI is getting legitimacy, probably a bump in their valuation. Apple, that was falling behind, is getting a bump in their valuation because of now the future potential of this. But if you really dig underneath the surface, like what I'm seeing as an investor is OpenAI has taken on a pretty big expense, and there's no clear way of monetizing that expense. Yes, there's indirect ways of monetizing, against that expense, like the legitimacy, the valuation, like all of
But what
those things.
expense? What expense necessarily here? Like, I mean,
Every time somebody sends one of these pictures over or sends a prompt over, it costs OpenAI money to. It might not be very significant, but it costs OpenAI to respond to that. And if it's coming from 100 million devices, even that's an expense.
yeah, I don't know if it's going to be that. So to me, the way that I approach it, and the reason I was asking you this question is, to me, it's very obvious what is in this for OpenAI, and it's not legitimacy. In my opinion, I've had a really hard time understanding what is in it for Apple on the partnership specifically.
Sure,
But what's in
sure.
it for
I agree with
OpenAI is
that.
just it's data. It's very easy. It's just data. Um, so OpenAI terms of services, actually, I don't want to speak out of place here, but like OpenAI tends to store your data, and I've seen instances where OpenAI, or I've seen stuff online that OpenAI is actually storing your data. But even if they're not storing your data, and even if the agreement somehow ensures that the data that you're sending over to OpenAI is not
Sure.
getting stored, the embeddings of the data are
Yep.
still getting used for training.
Yep.
So, quick context: embeddings are basically you have a prompt, you vectorize this prompt is a vector embedding that actually is a mathematical representation of whatever prompt you gave. That mathematical representation has the information that is relevant about the raw data. So the raw data may not even be stored, but the embeddings themselves are getting stored and most likely are getting used to train and improve the model. And it's
Sure.
very clear. And I mean, like what we're doing with ADON, we are living and breathing this space of data value and data
Yep.
and,
Yep.
and, and, and the markets of data. So it's very clear that for OpenAI, this is very much a data play.
Yeah, no,
Now, the flip
absolutely.
is,
And it's not very different than what happened 20, 30 years ago. It was similarly a data play, but it was more, hey, you're valued. You can lose money to get more users, and you're valued based off of your users, right? So it's the same exact thing. It's no different. They're saying, hey, we're willing to lose money to collect data, and the data eventually is the valuable piece. The same way that Facebook's users are the valuable piece, and we're going to monetize that later on. We're not going to monetize that today, or it might not be obvious how we monetize that today. So I understand that, but I agree with you. I understand what's in it for OpenAI, but I don't really understand why Apple is as at least the average person, like getting very involved with OpenAI, because underneath the surface, they're not doing that at all. And so that's why I was calling it a PR kind of thing, where they just added $200 billion or $300 billion to their market cap, right? By making this announcement. Now, if they had made this announcement with a much smaller no-name brand AI company, or if they had made this announcement with their own internal models, the question is like, would have it had the same impact? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I think for the when I start to get like very concerned about markets valuations, when companies start doing things for PR, and underneath the surface the reality is just very different. And we're getting to that point with AI where people are, even the largest companies in the world are trying to be in the press with AI in the name to bump valuations. And you start to get into pretty dangerous territory when that starts to happen.
I think it's tricky to say that Dan Anselm was just a bump with evaluation. I could see it, but I think there's a lot more underneath. And frankly, like you can go very speculative with this, like almost to the point of saying the Apple server model that's actually running on Apple's cloud is actually not a model that Apple developed themselves, but is actually some model that OpenAI gave them. Maybe just wild speculation here. I have literally zero proofs other than just like an idea that came to mind. Or you can just basically say, yeah, I mean, OpenAI no, OpenAI is a household name for AI right now, and then people associate AI with OpenAI, like the average user. And then people are probably going to trust OpenAI more on AI capabilities than Apple. So if Apple makes this announcement with OpenAI, then it's probably sending the message to potential
Sure,
consumers that is going to be
sure.
the best type of AI possible on this device. But but yeah, sure. Like you give the option, and then you boost sales that way because you're aligning with the household name in AI, much more than you would otherwise if you were alone, right? So I think there's a mix of things, but it just seems very well. I guess it just really depends, right? It will depend on what sort of volume of requests OpenAI sees because of this deal. How many
Even if
more
they only see
prompts?
5% of their users, right? They'll have more users coming from Apple than their own internal distribution, right? So it's just such a large user base that from their perspective, even if the penetration is 5-10%, it'll surpass like their own penetration.
Keep in mind though, keep in mind that it's not Apple Intelligence is not rolling out to all Apple devices, right? It's only
Sure.
last generation, but I still think this applies, right? Where even if you have like 5% of the the total latest generation device users actually using this product is a significant uptick and it's a significant amount of data.
Yeah,
But
because
yeah,
like public markets function like this. Like, I'm not saying that there was a conspiracy theory and everybody sat around and said, "Hey, like we got to pump the price $100 billion and then we'll all get out." Like, I'm not saying that's what's happening. But when you are the CEO of a company that is losing market share, right? It's a very large company, but it's losing market share. It's actually seeing dips in its for the first time in a long time, it's seeing dips in its iPhone sales. It's seeing dips in its overall revenue. That's happening. That happened last quarter and the quarter before, and people were paying attention to that. When you have that situation, it is tempting to come out and jump on the bandwagon, right? Largely to get people distracted to this new potential and get investors to focus on, the future. I don't think there was this grand plan to do it, but that's definitely a motivation because people are asking the question like, hey, like I'm an Apple shareholder, like where's my, you know, bull case with AI? Like why don't I get a 20% bump because of some bull case in AI, right? Um,
yeah, and to your point, Apple is trading at an all time high right now. So yeah,
so
totally.
CEOs like even if they don't wake up in the morning thinking that they're going to manipulate the market, right? They have shareholders, they have pressures from the media, they have pressures from everywhere, and so maybe not actively but passively they're like, yeah, I do want to join this bandwagon, right? And the more that starts happening, that's kind of my point. My point is that when you have the largest companies in the world kind of needing to make these big splashy like announcements to get on the bandwagon, you're getting to the end of a cycle. You're now stretching the cycle. People are really stretching to get onto the bandwagon, and that's usually where things get to a top, right? Where the expectations are at the absolute highest, and maybe the reality is close to that. But we can at least all, I think, generally come to the consensus that the expectations are peaking, right? Like there's like every company in the world is not going to grow their business 100x or 100% because of AI. That's not what's going to happen. But that seems to be the case because every time you add AI to your business's name, it goes up as if you're going to double your revenue, right? That's what I'm saying becomes challenging is that a few of those companies will double their revenue because of AI. But every company that adds AI to its name is not going to be able to do that, but they're all being valued as if they will. And that's when you start getting into really frothy markets.
It's interesting actually that I see a lot of the point that you're making of just speculation happening and the market reacting to speculation. One of the things that I wanted to kind of like take the conversation in this direction is a lot of the privacy concerns that were voiced with this announcement. So Elon
Mhm.
was very vocal when the announcement came out about it being absurd that Apple wasn't smart enough to make their own AI, and and then they're partnering with OpenAI, and then they still want to protect their privacy and so on. This is wrong, clearly. I mean, as you guys saw, and I just showed you, Apple did develop its own models. At least the model that's not running on the device. And it's also there's also a model running in like their own private cloud, and they're developing or they're launching this new version or this new OS that's running on the private cloud to enforce privacy. But Elon was basically saying that if there was an integration at the open source level, that he would ban Apple devices from all of their premises and so on and so forth. But the thing that I'm trying to highlight here is that some people, at least in the tech community, voice some concerns um, around privacy. And I want to ask you a couple of things here, Hamiz. Do do institutional investors care about privacy concerns here at all? And beyond institutional investors, is your take that retail investors generally care about privacy as much as we do, especially since we work in the field and we have like philosophical convictions around privacy and so on?
Mhm. Mhm. I think that like us, at least internally, have been have to care a lot about privacy, right? Because we're dealing with such critical information, such important transactions that us as a company, like we've had to separate devices from day one, and the gold standard has been Apple devices. So many of these businesses are not allowed to interact with any chat GPT or any AI at all, even when there's an option to turn off, sharing data with OpenAI. Because most people inherently expect that even though you turn it off, in the background there's something being shared and happening, right? And we have so many regulators regulating the financial industry that it's just not worth the risk. It's not worth the squeeze to have a breach like that happen, right? And so from our perspective, at least, like iPhones have been this like very dependable, simple place to go, right? And now the decision is not so obvious anymore, right? Because now it's like, okay, who knows what's actually happening in the background? So they just went from like this very obvious choice for anybody with any privacy concerns to, hey, we actually have to check the user terms of service here as well, right? And so the brand that they built over the years, many, many times, worked very hard, spent a lot of money to like be in that bucket of obvious choices is not so obvious anymore. So I think it does hurt the brand long term. But for the average user, I don't know if it matters to them. They kind of have come to terms, I think, with the idea that they're selling their data and privacy in return for cheap or subsidized or free services. I think a lot of people have kind of come to, in maybe not openly, but in the back of their mind, they've kind of come to those terms, right? Um, and so I don't think it changes for them immediately, but I do think in the long run, it does change the very obvious choice that companies had.
Yeah, on the privacy piece, I think this is interesting. I don't know if Apple Intelligence. I think I would disagree that Apple Intelligence hurts the Apple privacy brand. I think it's still very strong, and in the way that they announce it, and the way that they try to position, and the fact that they're deploying a model, they're literally deploying models on your device, which is something that a lot of people have been dreaming about doing for a long time, and nobody has been able to actually crack. Like there's some stuff that came out. The Rabbit, Rabbit was just a freaking wrapper to ChatGPT in a plastic case, right? Which is kind of a funny, funny story. But don't want to go down that tangent. But yeah, crazy, crazy. But still, the fact that they're deploying a model on your device and making sure that the inference is running on your device already tells you tons about how much they care about the privacy. And in their announcement that they made, so they announced this private cloud compute, called or acronym PCC, which is basically, let's see if we can find it here. Um, yeah, which is basically, it's running on a new OS, but this new OS, frankly, is just the same traditional server, probably like a Mac OS server or even a Linux server. It just doesn't have any storage. You can't access it remotely. Like there's no developer access that can access it remotely, and some other stuff like encryption and what have you. There's nothing special here, but like they really went out of their way. This was not in their demo. This video was not in their demo. This was part of their State of the Union report, but they went out of their way to actually explain, hey, yeah, look, we're actually trying to be very keen on privacy with this new deployment. But what I think is really intriguing here, and I think just the public hasn't been educated enough to be able to start elevating the discussion around this, is what is happening with your data when you interact with models. Um, and not only what's happening with your data, but like what is your position around the usage of the embeddings that you're giving the model. So when you interact with a model, like models don't really understand, they don't really understand human text and they don't really understand images. A transformer model, always when you interact with it, you vectorize the input data into vector representations. These are basically mathematical representations of the input data. And then that is actually what's fed through the transformer. And then at the end, you have like another tokenizer that's basically grabbing the output and then turn that into actually understandable human language or images, right? Generally speaking, you have to vectorize the data, and then that's how you interact with the model. But what's interesting is that the moment that you vectorize your input data, those embeddings, they're usually fed through the model, and then the model gives you an output. But what I haven't seen enough people discuss, or I don't think like the conversation has gotten to that point yet, is taking the embeddings and saving the embeddings okay, or is it not? So you have a word, you turn that word into a vector embedding, you feed it through the model, but still you keep that embedding. I mean, vector storage is not as cheap as just like raw text storage, obviously, but that's something that a lot of these companies are doing this, right? A lot of these companies say we don't store your raw data, and they may actually not be storing your raw data, but the embeddings are still getting stored. So I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't think there's been a lot of discussions around how embeddings are getting used, and this hasn't been disclosed yet. And this is pretty common practice in the industry. So I don't know.
So, okay, so let me ask you a question to try to solve this. Um, do you think doing payment for order flow is okay? What Robinhood does with Citadel and everybody else, do you think that's okay?
It is kind of like a almost like an unnecessary evil. Same thing with MEV, right?
Yeah.
MEV on chain. Yeah.
So yeah, so to a lot of people, right, like there's no such thing as a free lunch. I don't care what they're saying is a free lunch. It doesn't matter. The same way that Robinhood said it was free trading, and Facebook said that it was free social media, and Google said it was free Google search, right? Like it doesn't matter. These are publicly listed companies or privately held companies with investors they have to answer to. And it might not be today, but when people are not paying attention, the terms of service will slowly start to drift to the point where people will have they will have a way to monetize this, right? Because if they don't, there's millions of investors on their backs asking them for ways to monetize it, right? So I think it's like a little naive to think that This might start the right way. A lot of things start the right way, but with enough pressure from investors and just enough capitalism, like it ends up drifting a certain way. And so I think maybe the people who are building this first version of Apple Intelligence have like the best intention and they want to just give it out for free because that's what's good for people, but they have a business to run and that business will drive their decisions in the future. And so I don't believe that there's a free lunch. I do believe those embeddings are both valuable and can be stretched to the point where the definition of embeddings gives them access that you wouldn't necessarily be comfortable with. So the same way that payment for order flow, like whether you pull the ear from here or you go around the head and pull it from here, it doesn't really matter, right? Like there has to be a way for the business to make money, and I just feel like that we're.
Yeah, I agree that there's no free lunch, but I think over time users become educated enough to understand what's happening. It takes time, but they understand eventually. And either implicitly or explicitly, you know what's happening when you go interact with social media. And then alternatives start to emerge. And then there's people who pick and choose and decide to give up or
Mhm,
maybe pay for an alternative, and try to get away from a model that is taking that away from you, right? So
mhm, mhm.
yeah, it's tricky, and I think it requires a lot of. There's no free lunch for sure, but I think it requires a lot of user education to
But they're making
understand.
it sound like a free lunch, right? They're like, hey, you're not storing your data. It's just the embeddings. And as soon as somebody starts talking to me like that, I'm like, hey, man, listen, I'm not a child. I'm a capitalist. I understand, right? Like,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
don't have to sugarcoat it for me. Like, if you just tell me straight, hey, I'll store your data, I'll give you a free iPhone. Okay, we can talk. But don't patronize me, right? Like, don't make it seem like you're doing this for me. You're not doing this for the betterment of the world. Right? And if you
yeah.
are, then I don't want to be an investor in you, right? Like, so my point is that uh, I would much rather be treated like straight and like somebody tells me, hey, here's an iPhone that's $1,000 and we will never store your data and won't store embeddings or anything in between. Here's an iPhone for $500 and we will store all these other things. I'll be like, okay, now you're really giving me a choice because most of the times they give you the impression of a choice, but you don't really have a choice. Like Facebook is so large today that you get no choice, right? Like it's not like you can decide on another social media platform. But there are a lot of people on Facebook that if they gave a real option, people would choose a certain way. And I'm not saying it's the majority. I actually don't believe that. I think the majority is implicitly okay with this. But for the people that are not, I do believe that they should have a choice.
Okay, that's good. That's a good discussion on Apple Intelligence. Let's move on to some closing remarks here. I
Of
mean,
course.
any final thoughts around Apple's announcement or the current state of AI?
There's a like what I would like to say about this whole thing, right? I might come off as like very skeptical of the business models here and things like that, and that's just because there's a limited amount of money that can be captured in this race, right? It's not unlimited revenue available for all these companies. When people start acting like every company with an AI product has no ceiling and no competition, that's when things get really, really messy because all across the board, everybody's pushing their models just a little bit more, adding another 20% bump in growth. But when that happens across the entire stock market, it's a big problem, right? Because there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. But right now, everybody's acting like there's only going to be winners. And you can't get anybody on CNBC or any of these hedge fund managers to publicly tell you which AI companies are not going to make it, right? Because they're gonna get burned for the next year or two trying to make those bets, right? But that will happen, obviously, and we should act like it will happen because it always does. And as soon as I start hearing this time it's different, that's when I know it's a tough time in the market, right?
So true, man. So true. Yeah, out of every 10 companies out there going at the same problem, one survives, maybe half survives.
Mhm.
Like I have like point 0.5 survives. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's tricky. There's definitely a lot of excitement around the space, but definitely both in public and private markets,
Mhm.
there's a lot of companies going at the same problem set, and yeah, I think the pie
Just
is going to get a lot bigger.
yeah,
But
just
a
look at
few,
the foundational model landscape, right? You just showed me, four different foundation models competing with each other, and then they're competing with Apple too, right? Like if you're a foundation model company, you can get whatever amount of money you want at whatever valuation you want. But we have to be realistic about how many of them can actually be sustainable businesses, right?
yeah, but you know what's really interesting is a lot of people are starting to agree and kind of converge on the idea that foundational models are a commodity. Like the model itself is a commodity. What's really unique is the data. And I mean, you have the data, you have the compute, you can pop out a model on the other side, right? So but yeah, not just in the foundational model space, like everywhere around AI, like ML ops, even data directly too, or infrastructure management, compute. There's so much stuff going on. There's so much stuff. Meaning, there's a couple problems that need to be solved still, and market opportunities in all of those problems. But there's so many companies going at the same problems. That's definitely like it's fierce competition out there in the market, and only a few are gonna make it out alive.
Okay. So, any last thoughts from you, Sam, as somebody who's like actively building in the space? Like, what do you look forward to? What are you worried about?
Yeah, so today, and I kind of mentioned a few things throughout the pod, but today I was very deep looking at some of the deals that have started to happen in the large enterprise space around data, and not just the deals, but also the lawsuits too. So, I mean, there was a Google Reddit licensing deal, the Reddit OpenAI licensing deal, the Shutterstock Apple licensing deal. Shutterstock also licenses data to a bunch of other companies, smaller media companies too, like Tumblr or FlickPick or a bunch of other companies are also doing a lot of these licensing deals. A lot of law firms are starting to get involved and trying to broker some of these licensing deals, and specialized data consultancy firms are also getting involved here. So it's just a really interesting market that is
Mhm.
emerging,
Mhm.
but it is all standing on very shaky grounds around what does it mean to use your data, like what is justified use of data, right? What is like um, what defines what data is publicly available, what defines what data is not publicly available, what is fair use, what is not fair use, and a lot of that hasn't been. There's no precedent set for that yet. I was actually surprised. I was looking at a report from a hearing in the Senate earlier this year talking about licensing issues around publishing companies and these large AI companies are just scraping a bunch of the web and trying to get a lot of the data to train their models. But it's interesting. I'm very curious to see what's going to happen, especially from a
Mhm.
regulatory standpoint, and to see if the issues around licensing have some more clarity coming from a regulatory standpoint. But it's really fascinating, though, even from a market perspective, to see the new markets popping up, um, just for data that are kind of like opaque and vague and
Yeah, I,
undefined.
I really I find that fascinating, and that's also why I'm very excited for your business. Is I find it fascinating, just the brokerage and the transactions of data, right? Because people have always kind of seen it that way, especially people in the industry, but not with the level of focus that we have right now. And so people used to call it the digital oil forever, but now they're really like acting like it is. So I'm very excited to see that. I think businesses the same way, like we were just discussing, right? 20 years ago, it was, hey, get a certain number of eyeballs and everything else will take care of itself. Now it's kind of like, hey, get a certain amount of data and everything else will take care of itself. So businesses are worth something simply because of the data they've been able to acquire. Um,
There's a lot of businesses who I was actually reading through this earlier today. There's a lot of businesses, early media businesses in the early 2000s that have like kind of like have been they've been half dead for the last 20 years, but they amassed a bunch of data early on. And now they're like, oh shit, we're sitting on billions of dollars worth of data. Let's go and sell it all and license it all. Even though like we have 10 monthly active users kind of thing, right? But yeah. And yeah, man, our approach is simple, man. It's all power to the people who actually made that data and should own that data and should earn the rewards and accrue the value from that data.
Mhm.
That's that simple. But
Very
okay,
interesting.
let's wrap here.
Yep.
Let's wrap here. Thank you, Hamiz, for the time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you to our listeners too for the time, and
Of course.
we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode.